I'm Larry Dark, the director of the Story Prize, and I'd like to welcome you to our 19th annual award night. If there's one thing that living through the pandemic has taught us, it's that sometimes you need to adapt to disruptions. In the words of the great Mary Lou Henner, success in life is defined by how well you deal with Plan B. Unfortunately, 2 of our 3 finalists could not be here live tonight. But we came up with a Plan B, and we're able to record their readings and interviews, which we will show here in this room, as well as on the live stream broadcast, and it'll be in the video we post also. And I have to say, I think they went pretty well, so it should be okay. The most important thing for us is the opportunity this event presents to honor these truly exemplary short story collections. This year's finalists are Andrea Barrett, Ling and Morgan Talty. The 2 who couldn't make it, I should just probably say the one who did make it is Ling but but I'm going to give their excuses too. The 2 who couldn't make it are Andrea Barrett. The storm snowed her in, could not come down today. She lives in way upstate New York. And Morgan Talty, the very recent birth of his first child and the unpredictability that follows such events made it difficult for him to attend. The good news is that, as I said, our 3rd finalist is here live with us. And we truly, truly, truly appreciate that. The format of the Story Prize event is to have the 3 finalists read from and discuss their story collections. We do that in alphabetical order by last name. By coincidence, it would work by first name too. I don't know middle names, but. So first, we'll share the recording of Andrea Barrett reading from natural history and having a conversation about her book with me. Then Ling in the flesh, will read from and discuss Bliss Montage. Lastly, we'll share Morgan Talty reading from and talking about Night of the Living Rez. The evening will culminate with Jay Lindsay, the president of the Chisholm Foundation, announcing this year's winner. And Julie Lindsay is also part of the Chisholm Foundation and the founder of this prize, so I have to acknowledge you too, Julie. We're grateful to the Chisholm Foundation, I am, for funding this award for all these years. Just so you know how we get to this point in the process, the Story Prize chooses the 3 finalists this year from among 119 short story collections we received as entries in 2022. Then 3 independent judges choose the winner. Our judges this year were Adam Dalva, Danielle Evans, and Miwa Messer. The breadth and quality of short story collections published each year never ceases to amaze me. It's difficult to pick just 3 books to honor as finalists and difficult for the judges to choose a winner from among them. These 3 collections in particular exemplify the excellence of the short story form. Natural History, Bliss Montage, and Night of the Living Rez are books well worth reading and buying. They provide an escape not from our thoughts, as television does, but to a deeper level of thought. In the pages of these stories, you'll find no mention of political divisions, school shootings, bank collapses, or other anxieties du jour. And you'll find very few mentions of technology, maybe a cell phone here and there, no internet really, and no social media. How great is that? What these books provide is compelling characters in original and inventive plots with skillful and satisfying writing on both the sentence and story level. Something else these books have in common, these in particular, is that much as they are about what they are about, they are also about storytelling and the unreliability of memory, the prevailing narratives we embrace in the absence of a single absolute truth, and what we invent to console and entertain ourselves. Okay. Our first reader, virtual reader, tonight is Andrea Barrett. She's the author of 9 previous works of fiction, including the National Book Award-winning Ship Fever and Pulitzer Prize finalist Servants of the Map. Her last book, Archangel, was a finalist for the Story Prize 10 years ago. She's the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, a Guggen Fellowship, and an NEA Fellowship, all the good fellowships, as well as a past finalist for the Story Prize and a recipient of the Ray Award for the short story. Having lived in Rochester, New York, and Western Massachusetts, she now resides in the Adirondacks. Natural History offers a series of connected stories that further explores characters from stories in her previous collections. Ship Fever, Servants of the Map, and Archangel. Andrea frequently writes about women scientists from periods as far back as the mid-19th century. Her abilities to convey her characters' inner states and to write evocative description draws readers in. Her reading tonight is from the title story, the last in the book, Natural History.
I'm going to read a bit from the title story, Natural History, which forms the second part of this book. It's narrated by a character named Rose Marburg, who I've written about, first in Ship Fever almost 30 years ago, and in several stories since then. In this story, she's living in a small cabin in the Adirondacks after having left behind her life in central New York. And I'm going to read from the beginning of the story, so I don't really need to set up very much. So here's the beginning of Natural History. This is what the book looks like. And there she was when I opened the door, Deirdre, my old friend. She'd seen the cabin, which I'd brought back when visitors to Silver Lake would have been hard-pressed to guess which of us would be better known. Some might have bet on me, Rose Marburg. I published my papers and won my prizes early. The wiser would have chosen Deirdre Banks. On that August day in 2018, I opened the door after 30 years, and she said, stepping over the threshold and bumping into the clumsy shelves, I can't believe it's still the same. Pretty much, I said. She eyed the old wood stove, the table and chairs, the slumping couch. Not exactly, but you added a porch? A few years ago. She moved toward the screened-in space and sat where I'd hoped she would, in the chair facing the kingbird's nest. The male obligingly flicked down, scooped up a bee, and returned to his mate. I tacked the porch under the back of the cabin, which otherwise was one high-peaked room centered around the chimney, with a sleeping loft over the front third, bathroom and cooking space tucked beneath that. Once I'd imagined Deirdre visiting every year. I left her watching the birds while I boiled water and found hibiscus tea for the pretty glass teapot she'd bought as a gift. Her hair had changed since the treatments, but a clever stylist had shaped the coarse strands into chic feathery points. Long creases in front of her ears, deep folds in the skin of her neck, hands as veiny and spotted and dry as my own, with the cracked yellowish nails that came from years of working with chemicals in the lab. When we were young, she would have scheduled a manicure before the Silver Lake gathering. 2 weeks every summer, 100 or so structural biochemists, each time a different topic, but always amazing talks, wild arguments, unexpected collaborations springing up among researchers sprawled on the large flat rock beside the lake, or playing badminton poorly. We'd been invited first as postdocs, when the chance to go there meant everything. We primped before that first nervous arrival, and even after several summers, we still painted our toenails and bought new shorts. I bought this cabin, which was 4 miles from the main gate of Silver Lake, after one of our visits. An easy drive even at night, and then crowed to no more sleeping in the infamous dormitories or sharing squalid bathrooms. I'd sleep in the loft, and she could sleep on the couch near the wood stove whenever she wanted. We'd use it every summer. Instead, I dropped out of science, and for years had hardly visited what was once my favorite part of the world. Sometimes I've been able to rent the cabin out for the summer, which paid the taxes. Other years, it sat empty save for the odd week or two, colonized by the mice who, when I returned, were reluctant to leave. Deirdre, who'd followed me into the kitchen, found one of them as she rummaged around for some sugar. "The fuck," she said, jumping back from the open cabinet. Gently, apologizing, I nudged her aside and closed the door. The creature, who had drowned in an inch of olive oil at the bottom of an old bottle lacking its cap, now floated belly up, preserved like mouse confit. Pink paws, closed eyes. Deirdre must have seen the paws. I'd found it last fall when I'd moved in full time, and sometimes I imagined it talking to me. It, the other mice in the crawl space, the turkeys pterodactyling through the woods, the coyotes who sang around the cabin at night. Sometimes it was so quiet that my own breath startled me. To Deirdre, as if we were both city people and this was a rural joke, I said, "Isn't that odd? I found it before Christmas, and it was so astonishing I hung on to it."
Thanks, Andrea. It was really great to hear that. You know, one interesting thing about this collection is, I guess, the family tree in the back of the book that shows the connections between characters in all of the stories, and not just in this book, but other books you've written. Was this a goal when you began, or did this just unfold as you started writing these stories?
It really just unfolded. I had done a version of the family tree years ago at the back, I think, of Servants of the Map. But, you know, this process all started with Ship Fever, which dates from 1996, and which I never thought anything else would come from. And when I finished the title novella of that, I wanted to write what I thought would be a little story about one of the characters, someone named Ned Kind. I thought it would be a short story set in the Arctic, and it turned into a novel called The Voyage of the Narwhal. And then when I finished that, I wanted to find out more about what happened to Ned and a couple other people, and I just started writing some more stories, and somehow they all got connected together. I really didn't have any kind of grand plan, or I never thought, oh, I'm going to make 6 books, 2 novels, and 4 sets of short stories, and all the characters are going to be related to each other, because that would be manifestly crazy, right?
Yeah.
But it just turned out that way. In a sense, it's been incredibly lucky because the family tree and the fact that everyone's related has been a kind of story generating mechanism for me. One story just seems to finish, but to open a door to the next story or the next set of characters. I can't pretend to understand how that's worked, but I'm glad that it did work out.
Do you find that there are advantages or maybe even some disadvantages to already being familiar with certain characters and settings? And do you have to go back and make sure that you're consistent with things that are in the previous stories they appear in?
There's both advantages and disadvantages, as you wisely suggest. The advantages are I have some settings set up. I have all these characters. I know how they're related. I know some things that have happened to them that you don't know because I haven't written them yet. The disadvantages are that as I got farther and farther along, and particularly when I got into this book, the web has gotten so dense and the number of characters whose fate to keep track of has gotten so large that I can't actually keep track of them anymore. I have a huge document in my computer. It's like a chronology. It starts in the 1700s and runs through 2020. And for some years, there's a whole page for the year about what happened to which character when. I have to go back and check that now almost with every sentence I write, which is why I grew sure that this was the last book in the series. I can't manage it anymore. The world got so full and so big that I can't keep up with it. I need an assistant, or I need to write something new. And I think the choice is the latter.
So speaking of the chronology, how far back in time does this go? And you mentioned 2018, so that's as close to the present, I think, as the
Right.
stories come.
The earliest that this book goes back to is when Henrietta is a little girl, coming up on the beginning of the Civil War. So I think the first date that's mentioned here is maybe 1857 or 1858. If you track the chronology through all the other books, there's one story that takes place in the 1680s, and not many in the 1700s, but a few. It mostly runs from the very early 1800s through more or less now.
I'm going to make this sort of a two-part question, but I imagine you have to do a fair bit of research to make sure you're true to the period. So one question is about that. But the other question is, what attracts you to writing stories set fairly long ago? And most of the stories in this book are. I mean, the end is the one that's close to the present.
Right. I think what initially drew me was that I have such a love for 19th century literature and also 19th century science. That was the first biology I knew, was Darwin and Wallace and all his fellow botanists and geologists and physiologists, everybody. And it sort of spread forwards and backwards from a point that is roughly 1860. I feel myself working in both directions from that. And I do have to do a lot of research, but for me, that's pleasure, not work. And so it gives me an excuse to read an enormous amount of stuff. And once I got a little more familiar with the world of kind of science and natural history from roughly 1840 to 1880, then I began to feel more secure about researching prior to that and after that. The place I'm least comfortable with is probably the last of the Henrietta stories in natural history as I edge up on the 1920s. That was a whole new world for me. I get that it's 100 years ago, but I really had to start almost from scratch there to get some of that under my belt and think about prohibition and what was going on.
Yeah. And prohibition is relevant in that story because some of the main characters own a winery on the verge of prohibition, and maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, the whole first part of the book is set in a place that I call Crooked Lake, but which is close to actual Keuka Lake, and in a town that's very like the actual Hammondsport. And that is a place where all of the Finger Lakes, they've been growing grapes for wine there since the middle of the 19th century with varying success and varying varieties. So the valleys there are all planted with grapes, and there's wineries and processing plants all along. So prohibition was an enormous factor there and had a huge impact on those valleys and all the people there, but not just the farmers, but the winemakers, the people who made crates for the winemakers, the people who wove baskets to pick up the grapes. It just spreads and spreads and spreads. It's a big industry, so it affected everybody.
Another question about that is when you go back and you write about historical periods, and also, most of the book is about scientists also. Do you ever hear from readers sort of with like, gotcha, not correct, this couldn't have happened, they didn't know this yet, and any of that kind of response to the book?
I live in dire fear of that, but it actually hasn't happened to me yet. I'm sure it will at some point, but I know a tiny bit of science myself, not much, but enough to read 19th century science, which is comprehensible to us now.
Mm-hmm.
Married to someone who came up as a scientist, and a lot of my friends are scientists, and I read a lot. So were I to write about 21st century scientists, I think someone would catch me out pretty quickly. But the trick I use in writing about 18th, 19th, and early 20th century science is I read the textbooks and the articles that the people were reading then. I don't read anything from now to filter my perceptions through somebody else's understanding. I just go to the library or the internet, and if Henrietta's studying moths in 1870, I read the entomology journals from 1870. So in a funny way, I'm kind of preserved from that sort of anachronism as long as I keep my nose to the world of what people had in their studies and their libraries then. I'm relatively safe, and I think that's what's helped me somewhat.
When I read these stories, I feel a certain nostalgia for the simplicity of the time. So much of the science is about going out and finding moths and caterpillars and watching them, and it's all about what you see with your eyes and how observant you can be. On the other hand, you also get a sense of how difficult life was then without some of the conveniences we have then. So, do you feel a certain nostalgia for that time, or is it just where you find yourself when you're writing the stories?
I feel the same easy nostalgia everybody does. I think, oh, I wish I didn't have a cell phone and an internet and a car and I could just be out in the world looking at moths and caterpillars. But I'm also conscious of the fact that I'm a woman, so I wouldn't have been permitted to do most of the things I've been able to write about. I'm a woman with very poor vision, which I wouldn't have been able to see at all. And I probably would have died by the time I was 16. I'm not that well put together. I'm dependent on modern medicine and modern eyeglasses and modern everything. And that's what I mean by saying that's kind of an easy nostalgia. I would not be myself in this body doing the work I adore then. So I have a lot of admiration for people like Henrietta who were sturdy enough to really go out and make those observations by herself and come home and then do all the cooking and caring for her sister's children on a wood stove and with no electricity and no help. It was a hard life for everybody by our standards. So,
Yeah, Henrietta Atkins is almost like the main character, if you can have a main character of a story collection. Do you feel a particular affinity for her, and why do you think that is, if you do?
I do feel surprisingly close to her. I wrote about her in two stories in Archangel, and there she sort of initially came onto the scene as a secondary character meant to help a little boy and the investigators. But it was so interesting to me when she popped up wading around a pond with a skirt tied around her waist and looking at some fish. And I thought, wow, who is that? And then I wrote about her more in a story called The Island, where she befriended a young woman named Daphne. And then their friendship became intensely interesting to me. And I think part of the reason I'm drawn to her and to that pair is that the idea of women working together who are neither of them are married, but they're also not in a romantic relationship with each other. They're in a very intense friendship, and the idea that women can be together in that way, that we can work together and share ideas with each other, that we'll get crabby with each other, that we may compete with each other, that we may get cross with each other, absolutely, but also that behind all that, we can support each other and help each other be our fullest selves in the world. That's really important to me, and I think that's why I'm so attached to her.
You answered my next question about female friendship, so now I have to come up with a different one.
Uh,
Um, do you do you hear from, again, do you hear from certain people, but do you hear from female scientists about this? I would think that in these stories would really appeal to them because of some of the obstacles, not just way in the past, but in the current frame of the 2018 story as well.
I
That's
do
what
hear
happens.
them occasionally, and it's very moving to me when someone writes to me and says, "Oh, this." made me remember what I was like when I was a young woman in graduate school. Or sometimes people write and say, my mother was a geologist who taught in a high school in some small town, and I never thought so much about what life was like for her, but these stories really opened her world up for me. I'm so touched when somebody says that. Sometimes people will send me memoirs, or quite often happens that it's not the woman doing the science who writes me, but it's the spouse or the father or the son who writes and says, I got some illumination into the life of this woman I live with. And of course, I love that. That makes me feel like I caught something real there, that I wasn't just faffing around, that I did get to somewhere that I meant to.
There's a certain fearlessness to these women characters, and all of the stories in this book are, from women's points of view for the most part. There's some shifts into some male characters. Do you think that that's what it takes to do anything as a woman, or in the arts as a writer? Do you think that fearlessness is like an essential trait that is almost necessary? Otherwise, you don't get it done.
I think fearlessness at some level is. I don't think you have to be physically intrepid or socially intrepid necessarily, but at some level, even if, like me, you tend to stay inside your house and wait around in the snow, you have to have a kind of intellectual fearlessness, in the sense of being willing to try out material that you haven't seen someone else try out, or that you don't necessarily know well yourself. But you have to be willing to trust that you can learn it, that you can convey it. And you also have to have a certain, I'm trying to think of a polite way to say this. You have to be willing to not care too much about what other people might think of what you're doing, or it just becomes impossible to write. Anyway, I feel that way. If I thought too much about how people might receive what are essentially very odd stories about people that not everyone knows about, or if I let myself think, what if I get the science wrong and somebody yells at me? I just couldn't do it. So I do have to be fearless in that very confined way. Otherwise, I'm a very timid person. But
one thing I noticed in this collection, and in the other two collections also, maybe it's just me, but it seems like the stories are also about storytelling, about memory. There's a couple stories where that really comes into play. The title story, where there's a story within a story that fictionalizes what's happened in the past. There's a story about letters from the Civil War and how the histories are written. Is this something that that you found emerged as you write, or do you feel like you're always engaging with storytelling itself when you're writing a story?
I saw that after I was finished with the book, but I was less conscious of it writing the book. I do think that's something that's grown in my work over time and is more evident in this book than in any of the others. And the story about the Civil War letters, the regimental history, that I realized I was finally actively engaging with an idea that completely fascinates me. It's not just how our story's told, it's how is history told. Because history is just a different kind of storytelling. And I've been wrestling with that all my life. What is history? What is the difference between history and historical fiction? What does it mean that writers bring to history their own agendas, their own desires, their own everything? And that story, as I got into it, I didn't know that was what it was going to be about. But after a while, after a number of drafts, it was like, oh, okay. And then I sort of pushed that sense of it forward. So that was really fun for me to write and to think about. I still can't answer the question reasonably. If someone says to me, what is the difference between history and historical fiction? A 35-page essay later, and I still won't have answered it. But I love thinking about it more overtly, and I really loved thinking about it some through the mechanism of writing these stories.
It seems particularly relevant in recent years when it's become apparent, I think, that the truth is up for grabs, that history is up for grabs, that there's a struggle for controlling the prevailing narrative that will become history.
Right.
So I think that's an interesting element of the story about the Civil War and how the history was written. Not really,
Yeah,
but maybe you can answer that.
I mean, I can't answer it, but I could. Writing about the history of the Civil War, as far back as the title novella of Ship Fear, I was thinking about the stories and in particular the official histories of the Irish famine and how Irish immigrants came to Canada and America, and finding out as I dug more how much had been papered over, of
Mm-hmm.
course, how much had been whitewashed, and how many different ways there were to describe that. And I thought about it a lot again when I was writing Archangel, writing about the First World War, and how there were many stories about expeditions and efforts that people in this country knew nothing about, that the official histories were so sanitized. Certain squalid parts of wars are always pushed into the background and always kept from us. And the more, of course, the older I get and the more I read, the more aware I am of how much writing history as well as writing fiction is a process of selection. It's not even just that people are necessarily trying to obscure the facts or tell a different story. It's just that each writer selects her own set of scenes and facts to focus on, and by definition then pushes out of the frame everything else. And so I'm always really interested in trying to pull back into the frame the stuff that got pushed to the side.
In recent years, and by that I mean maybe the past 15 or 20 years, it's possible to do a lot of research on the internet. Do you find that you have to go to original sources sometimes to actually see a letter, touch a letter? Is any of that a part of your process? Because so much of this is about actually just like the handwriting that people have when they write things down and how they record things.
I'm old enough, been through every stage of this evolution. When I first started writing these stories, there was no choice but to go to the archives and the original sources and to rummage around in kind of broken and infested old books and touch old letters. There wasn't any way to find out the stuff. Now I can read that same actual stuff when it's been digitized online. It's very odd that I can sit in my office and look at a scan of a letter that somebody wrote in 1864 and do that. So I don't have to as much go back to the archival sources. I do sometimes because I like to, for just the reasons you say. I love to hold in my hand the letter. I love to smell the paper and to look at the way the ink has aged over time and to see the stains or spots that are on the letters, or to see how somebody kept their books carelessly or well. There's information there too, and it's palpably different to go into the library and take out a bound volume of newspapers from 1910 and to look at that same set of newspaper articles digitized. I mean, the weight of the volume of newspaper, the turning over of the acidy turning brown pages, it's just different. So now I do both.
Yeah, there's a certain charm I think you lose when you just see an image of something as opposed to the thing itself. Speaking of which, descriptions, you're really great at description. It's very evocative. Do you just keep notebooks of description to, access later, or is it just something you find as you get deep into the story, you're able to sum it up?
It's something that comes late in the story, actually. When I read biographies or writers, or I read their memoirs or letters, and I'm reading about someone who walked around always with a little notebook and wrote down wonderful descriptions of everything, I'm so filled with admiration and even I want to be that person, but I'm not that person. That's the stuff lives in my imagination. If I can't call it back into my own inner eye, then I can't bring it to you in the way that the story needs at that moment. once in a while I can, and then I have to get in the car and drive to wherever and just go see. But usually the things I describe, if the description's working, it's because it's something that made such a visual impression on me at some earlier time that I can call it back up. And as I write more comes back. We all know that process. It's you set pen to paper and you think, I'm just going to write about the shape of this white house, but you write the house was white and it sat on a hill. And then your mind says, and it had a portico that had 2 columns with wisteria coming up. And then your mind says, and the wisteria looped this. It's the magic of writing. It comes as we make it.
When you're writing about a particular story, do you find it changes the way you're seeing things? Just, in that moment at that time, for instance, are you walking around, looking for caterpillars and moths when you're writing a story that caterpillars and moths and their life cycle is central to?
Yeah, I totally am. It's funny, as you asked that question, I was just thinking about the caterpillars. I never used to look at caterpillars, and now it's like every day walking, I'm like, oh, caterpillar, caterpillar. And I have my little natural history book. Same with moss, same with lichens, same with almost everything, which is it's a great treat to have your eyes sort of newly sensitized to parts of the world that maybe weren't so apparent before. It makes the environment a lot richer for me. And it always keeps me learning stuff. I like that.
Well, I think it changes it for the reader, too. I think it does for me. Thank you very much. Thanks for reading and talking to me under these snowy conditions.
Well, thanks for all the great questions. You really make me think hard about what I'm doing, and I appreciate it.
Next is Ling Ma. She's a writer hailing from Fujian, Utah, and Kansas. She's the author of the novel Severance, which received the Kirkus Prize, a Whiting Award, the VCU Cabell First Novelist Award, and the New York Public Library Young Lions Fiction Award. She lives in Chicago with her family. Bliss Montage is a short story collection unlike anything I've ever read, and I've been reading more than 100 short story collections annually for the past 19 years. Ling boldly incorporates imaginative and speculative elements that amplify her characters' predicaments. These stories are surprising, funny, unpredictable, and moving. Ling.
I feel like I'm subsumed by this podium here. I just wanted to say thank you to Larry and to Julie for reading all of these story collections every year. And for a more selfish note, I wanted to thank Asher, Larry's son, for pulling my book out of the stack and giving it to his father. Tonight, I'll read a bit from the opening story of Bliss Montage. And it's one of the older stories in the collection. By this point, it feels almost as if someone else has written it. And I think that's maybe why I like reading from it. It's called Los Angeles. Just as a heads up, there's a few mentions of domestic violence, and there is a character who speaks in dollar signs, for which I will shake my house keys, which I brought all the way from Chicago. Thank you. Los Angeles. The house in which we live has 3 wings. The west wing is where the husband and I live. The east wing is where the children and their attending au pairs live. And lastly, the largest but ugliest wing, extending behind the house like a gnarled broken arm, is where my 100 ex-boyfriends live. We live in LA. Our house has the nicest view in the hills. From our Spanish tiled kitchen, I can see my old apartment complex down the hill, a coral stucco converted motel. The burned out sign says El Paraíso. Another girl lives in my studio now. In t-shirt and slip, She drinks a glass of juice, stands hunched over the sink in the kitchen that I painted seafoam green. It is 3 in the morning. It is 3 in the afternoon. She is there, I am here, and all of my ex-boyfriends who dated me there are also here. Aaron, Adam, Akiko, Alejandro, Anders, Andrew. Those are just the A's. My 100 ex-boyfriends and I hang out every day. We get into the Porsche 911 Turbo S, bunching into it as if it were a clown car, and drive down roads and boulevards, hills and canyons, palm frond-strewn avenues and parking garages of shopping malls. Jeff drives. The city sprawls out endlessly. Bougainvillea, the color of bruises, grows across people's fences. Sometimes a bamboo grove, sometimes a cemetery, sometimes a free clinic devoted to the removal of burst capillaries. The sun hits our faces, our eyes squint in the light, our hair billows in the wind. On the husband's credit card, 101 burgers at Umami Burger, 101 admission tickets to LACMA, 101 golden milks at Moon Juice. We go shopping, we go to Barney's, this is a very old story. We go to Koreatown, we go to Earth Cafe to do some light reading. Can I get an extra wheatgrass shot? Benoit says. Does this hoodie make me look fat? Fred says. It's almost time for us to go home, Chang says. And Aaron, he doesn't say anything. Neither does Adam. It is almost evening by the time we return to our gated community, the sky a layer cake of pinks and oranges. At the security booth, a black iron gate lifts heavy with its own weight. After we've disembarked, the husband returns home from the investment firm. He comes in quietly through our noiseless garage door. I know it's him when I hear the sound of ice clinking against glass, then bourbon pouring, glugging as it leaves the bottle. He lets it sit for a bit. Hi, honey, I say. How was your day? He says, well, did it go up or down? Does that mean you're working this weekend? The husband is a resting place. He has a chair. Sometimes I drape myself over him and I get the physical comfort of not being alone. I can feel it anytime I want, mostly Saturday nights, mostly Sunday mornings. But the times I need it most are the early evenings when I feel like I am dissolving. During this time, my ex-boyfriends scatter, and the husband and I go somewhere for dinner. I put on my plain coat, and we take the timeshare up to Marin County. By 8, we descend into Sausalito, where Danielle Steele lives, where moody conifers grow on steep hills, and the expanse of the deep bay laps at rocks along the shore. It's pretty here, but the only place to shop is Benetton. At the slow food restaurant on the harbor, an older couple at the next table beams our way. It takes a moment to see that we look like a younger version of them, sans their matching sweater vests and silvered hair. Between our tables, a span of 30 years. I return their smiles and look away. The husband orders a red wine, and I order a Diet Coke. Plates are laid out, tuna carpaccio encrusted with toasted sesame seeds, pea shoot tendrils tenderly clasping veal medallions in abstracted herb sauce, zucchini slivers dressed with mint dill reduction. The husband sips his wine, eats his veal while I tell him about the things my ex-boyfriends and I did all day, the art we saw, the items we bought. Dessert arrives, a vanilla torte with raspberry coulis and mascarpone cream. I try to enjoy it, but I can't seem to escape the gaze of the couple at the next table. The wife, she can't help herself. She leans over, puts her hand on my wrist, and says, "You will produce beautiful children." That's been done, I tell her, taking my hand away. I have one son and one daughter, one gangbangingly after the other. One is 6 and the other 7. They look and act so much like the husband. They chew with their mouths closed. They know the correct fork to use. At night, they crawl into my lap, full of easily disclosed secrets, light as folding chairs. At home, when the daughter spills raspberry juice on the carpet, the son chides, "This is why we can't have nice things." "No, that's not true," I tell them, looking at the daughter. "You can have everything." "Really?" she asks. "There is nothing you ever have to give up," I say. Pretty sure this is the wrong thing to say to a 6-year-old, but saying it anyway. "You can have your cake and eat it too." "I can have my juice and spill it too?" Sure, good use of analogy. My ex-boyfriends take turns teaching the kids new things. They practice piano, solve math exercises, demonstrate logic and rhetoric. "Find middle C," Felipe says. "Solve for X," Akiko says. "If A, then B," Han says. But Aaron, he doesn't say anything, and neither does Adam. There are 100 ex-boyfriends, but 2 that really matter. Their names are similar, Aaron and Adam, Adam and Aaron. Aaron because I was in love, Adam because he beat me. I met Adam first, then Aaron. The wound, then the salve. Maybe you don't know that you're wounded until you receive the salve that makes everything come back. After you get beaten, you don't go out. Your face swells into a snout. You don't buy Tylenol or groceries because you'd look like an animal loosened onto the streets. Instead, I stayed indoors. I washed the blood off the walls and the sheets. The splattered pillow I kept as evidence, not for anyone else, just for myself. I listened to music, Cat Power, the covers record. I caught up on my reading. From primer to abuse. Practice abusers don't hit a woman in the face. The novice abuser is pushed to it only by extreme, uncontrollable conditions. I read it again. I read it again. Not conditions, emotions. I brushed up on philosophy. To live is to exist within time. To remember is to negate time. All of my remembering begins late in the afternoon and lasts late into the night. How do I know, Adam once asked before he struck me, if what you feel is real and not something you felt for everyone else that came after and for everyone else that came before and everyone that will come after? After dinner, the husband and I take the timeshare back to LA. It is dark as we sweep across the wingspan of California. Below us, lights go on, city by city, time passing. LA is so beautiful at night from afar, a constellation of stars. It sprawls out and around, not so much a city as a series of urban planning decisions made without foresight. Frank Lloyd Wright mansions give way to Le Corbusier-style churches, mid-century bungalows cohabitate with Mediterranean villas, pleasure palaces rub up against ascetic lifestyle centers. There is no pattern, there is no meaning. Beneath the plain blanket, the husband's hand finds mine. He asks, "How can I not be?" I answer, and squeeze his hand. Thank you.
So, I have to ask, in the audiobook,
Yes.
how do they do the dollar that they're doing with shaking the keys?
I heard that there's the sound effect of the cash register. I haven't listened to the audio, but that's what I heard.
How did you come up with that idea of the husband speaking in dollar signs and cents later on?
How did I first come up with it?
Yeah.
Well, I was trying to research on what someone would say who works at an investment firm. As a placeholder, I just put a bunch of dollar signs, and then as soon as I put that down, I thought, that's it.
Can you name the rest of the boyfriends? You only named
I actually
really did.
Yes, but I don't, most of the names escape me now.
It was funnier hearing you read it than it was reading it to myself even. Do you laugh when you're writing things like this?
Yes. Sometimes, this is a strange story because when in class, I actually show my workshop students the very earliest draft of this story, and then just an excerpt from the earliest draft, and then the final published version. And, I hadn't looked at it myself for years, and what I was struck by was just how the very earliest draft, it was almost like baby speak, almost. I'm not sure why, but maybe because English is technically my second language, but the prose style is never right like the first draft. It's almost like sort of this garble of language, but usually by like the third or fourth draft, if the prose style isn't right, then I feel that the idea that I started with is wrong. So I try to go back and sort of tinker around with the idea before I go on. Yeah.
So were the 100 boyfriends always in the story, or was that something you added later on?
They were always in the story, but they were very much rescinded in the background. And I'm not entirely sure why they were rescinded or why I had even put them there in the first place. I just thought, initially the story was called House Husband, and I just thought it was about marriage. And then I realized, yeah, something else was going on.
In the next story,
That was
Oranges?
Oranges, yeah.
you sort of break out that character Adam, who's abusive.
Yes.
And I must say, it's a kind of a shock when it takes that dark turn in Los
Yeah.
Angeles.
Yes.
How does that happen? Is that your intention all along to write about an abusive boyfriend, or does it just sort of happen?
I wrote Oranges several years after writing Los Angeles, and for some reason I just wanted to maybe tackle that topic from a more realist standpoint. So what happens in Oranges is that this woman is leaving her place of work, and then she spots someone familiar and starts to follow him. And it is Adam, who she had passed with, and so she follows him into his current residence. And it's interspersed with flashbacks throughout. I'm not sure, there's a dream that occurs in Oranges, and I think initially all I had wanted to do was try to figure out that dream. It was try to write that dream and then write the story around that dream. And then I realized, oh, this is a compliment to Los Angeles.
It's one of the few stories, well, I wouldn't say one of the few stories, but it's one of the stories in the book that doesn't have this, let's say, imaginative element. Like
Yeah, like a
boyfriend.
fantastical.
Fantastical thing, yeah. So what do you like about introducing a fantastical element? For instance, I don't know if it's the next story, but there's a story G
Oh, yeah.
about drugs that makes you invisible.
Yeah, I had initially, that story, I had scenes of it around for years. It's about two close friends. One is leaving for New York the next day, and they spend one last sort of evening together. And initially, that's what all those scenes were about. I thought, okay, well, they'll have some kind of reckoning with their friendship. But I couldn't, I had those scenes for years because I could not proceed with that story until I realized, until suddenly the invisible drug, this drug that makes you invisible came in. And then suddenly that sort of forced some of their issues into the story, into the surface. And I'm not sure why or how I had the idea for the invisible drug, but I did work at Playboy, so I was initially thinking of like, oh, some kind of drug that might remove you from the male gaze, but then as I proceeded to the story, the drug came to take on many different meanings.
Yeah, it's funny you mention that because I think if a couple of men took a pill to make themselves invisible, they would have a very different evening than the women do. They'd probably do something pervy like a women's steam room or something. But these women are sort of content to just maybe do a little bit of mischief.
Yeah.
Just sort of explore, have an adventure.
Yeah, they're kind of reenacting sort of their old friendship. It was a drug that was popular during their college years, and they decided to kind of try again.
And I think it fits in very well with some of the other stories too, because I think there's a lot. There's these, I don't know, surreal elements also, and disappearance is sort of a theme. And I was wondering if that relates to your experience. I mean, is assimilating like disappearing in some way? Is that something you're thinking about when you add that element?
Is assimilating like disappearing? Is that the question? I hadn't thought about it in that way. But yeah, I suppose. So I think that takes on a special resonance. As far as, yeah, I didn't intend for all of these stories to have such thematic resonance, but I was writing them within the same time frame, even though I had scenes around for years. Many of them were drafts of something that I had just given up on, but I would work on several stories at a time, and then I would kind of write as far as I could go, and then get stuck, work on another story, go as far as I could, get stuck, and then I would do that through like 6 stories. And I think there was a pattern of thought that emerged because I was trying to complete them all within the same time frame. Yeah, there is a kind of, I guess, thinking that happens in fiction writing that I can't seem to make happen in other prose forms, such as, I can't seem to convey those same ideas in an essay for some reason, but I can kind of do it in fiction. And maybe it's because the creative approach is more exploratory, I'm not sure.
I'm going to read something because I picked out a line that I think is pretty significant. It's in the story Office Hours, which also has a fantastical element, kind of a secret room off of, or not even a secret room, a secret place or space. So there's a relationship between a woman who at first is a student of film and then becomes a film professor. And this is with a professor, and he says, it is in the most surreal situations that a person feels the most present, the closest to reality. Is that something that, does that explain to somebody like your approach, your technique while you're doing that? Are you trying to elevate the reality of the story in a way?
Yeah, I don't purposely set out to do that. I always try to make a stab at a more traditional realist fiction. But I think when I thought of that line, I was probably thinking about catastrophe and the way that being confronted with something catastrophic actually pushes you closer to its reality, jostles you out of your daily routines and the minutia of everyday life, what you're used to, and you're forced to kind of reckon or confront in some way. And so maybe that's why I like to bring the fantastical in often, because it's the site of where you start to realize, you start to get jostled out of everyday routine.
While we're talking about the film issue, I've seen in interviews with you that the title was Montage is a film term. Can you say what that term is and why you made that the title of the book? There's no story with that title, but why do you think that's a good title for the book?
Yeah, the Bliss montage in a film is traditionally when sort of an edited sequence that shows you the character going on a pleasure spree, enjoying things. So if you think about Home Alone, Lost in New York, Home Alone 2, Lost in New York. There's Kevin McAllister who realizes he's in New York with his parents' credit cards, and then there's this whole edited sequence where he's like buying firecrackers in Chinatown, and then hitting up a toy store, getting pizza, going to the top of the Empire building. And I think, that Bliss montage, it originated with the women's film. It's an outdated sort of film genre, and we would see the heroine or the anti-heroine sort of go, finding her man or something, going shopping with him, going to dinner or something. It's like the very truncated sequence of happiness that she's allowed, which I just learned while writing this book. So somehow it seemed appropriate, and maybe just personally as a fiction writer, I always start with pleasure. I always start with the parts that make me enjoy the story. So imagining what like a drug that makes you invisible might feel like in terms of physical sensation. It kind of springboards me into the story, and then we kind of move outward from there and see. But I've often discovered, if you try to inhabit like a fantasy, because fantasies aren't really meant to be inhabited, they like tear apart as soon as you try to step inside them. They always turn nightmarish, basically. And so, I don't know why, but many of my stories end up becoming nightmarish.
So at what point do you decide to make that the title? Is that toward the end? You have a collection of stories, you're looking at the titles of the individual stories, seeing if any of them work, or is it something you come up with sooner that guides you a little bit in writing and putting together the book?
It was towards the end, and I think it was the same with the novel too. It was always sort of towards the end that I realized what I'm trying to do. Yeah, it's usually always in the end where I kind of reread everything, try to find patterns, and then try to think about the title that way.
Yeah, I'm always interested because most collections there's a title story, but there are some that don't, and I think it's an interesting approach. Are you always writing stories even when you're writing a novel, or do you sort of shift from one to the other? Your first book was a novel, which I wrote about called Severance. How does that work for you as a writer? And how do you know when you start to write something or when you have an idea of what it is, what form it's going to take?
I always have like a few things cooking at once, and sometimes the novel actually ends up subsuming what I think are just individual stories, and sometimes the stories are just supposed to be stories. Many of the pieces that ended up in Bliss Montage did exist just as sort of scenes that I just couldn't, that I wanted to make into stories, and for some reason at the time I couldn't. They could have been, several years old, and I think I had to become maybe a more learned writer to kind of swing back and complete them, or not even complete them, but write the whole thing, write most 90% of it.
Were there any of these, imaginative or surreal ideas that you came up with that you couldn't make work? Is there an example of anything you tried to do that didn't, or does it usually just come into the story and work for you?
Every story I worked on during the pandemic year ended up in the book. If they failed, you can, you'll see for yourself, I guess, whether.
Well, I don't mean the story, I mean an idea, like invisibility or 100 boyfriends or, an arm of a pregnant. The arm arm of the baby with the pregnant woman sort of sticking out.
I think I might have a few other ideas cooking that have been out there for a while, but I'm not sure yet. Maybe I'll feel more compelled to return to them later.
I think this is going to be an influential collection in a way, like the way after George Saunders, a lot of people began to write like him. Have you ever seen stories in this vein elsewhere, or do you feel it's pretty much, your own approach?
I feel like I always read Kafka and then I feel better.
There is that, yeah.
I was reading his diaries to my students, and in one entry he said, he was talking about the metamorphosis, and he said it's imperfect to its very marrow. It would have been better if I hadn't taken that 2-day business trip in the middle of Friday.
Well, thank you very much. Morgan Talty is, Night of the Living Rez is a debut book of his, and it has already garnered a lot of attention, a lot of great reviews. Even this month, as he also had his first child, he won a couple book awards. The Penn Bingham, which is for a debut short story collection, Sue Kaufman Award, which is also for a debut writer. So he's really been on a roll, and I think I found what I wrote. Night of the Living Rez collects a dozen stories, for the most part alternating between a young adult character named Dee and a boy named David, both living on the Penobscot Reservation in Maine and contending with difficult situations. Despite the problems David and Dee routinely encounter, Morgan also shows tender moments and strong familial ties. It's our pleasure to have Morgan's participation even at a distance.
I'm going to read from my story collection, Night of the Living Rez. I'm going to read the first story, Burn. Burn. Winter, and I walked the sidewalk at night along banks of hard snow. I'd come from Rab's apartment off the reservation. Rab, this white guy with a wide mouth and eyes that closed up when he laughed, sold pot. He was all no bullshit, too. I had asked for a gram, and after he weighed it and put it in a plastic baggie and held it out to me, I reached into my pants and jacket pockets looking for the cash among the cigarette wrappers and pocket knife, and he didn't believe me as I acted the part and kept saying, "Shit, shit, shit, it must have fell out on the walk over here." He shook his head, took the weed out of the baggie, and put it back into his mason jar. "I ain't smoking you up," he said, and so then I said, "Fuck you, Rab, I really did lose the money. You'll see. Watch when I come back here in 30 minutes with the money I dropped. You'll feel stupid then." He shrugged a "sorry, man," and I slammed his door shut as I left. At the bridge to the reservation, the river was still frozen, ice shining white-blue under a full moon. The sidewalk on the bridge hadn't been shoveled since the last nor'easter crapped snow in November, and I walked in the boot prints everyone made who walked the walk to Overtown to get pot or catch the bus to wherever it was us Skeejans had to go, which wasn't really anywhere because everything we needed, except pot, was on the res. Well, except Best Buy or Bed Bath & Beyond, but those natives who bought 4K Ultra DVDs or fresh white doilies had cars, wouldn't be taking the bus like me or Phyllis did each day to the methadone clinic. That was another thing that Rez didn't have, a methadone clinic, but we had sacred grounds and sacred grounds where sweats and peyote ceremonies happened once a month, except since I had chosen to take methadone, I was ineligible to participate in native spiritual practice, according to the doc on the res. Natives damning natives. The roads on the res were quiet, trees bending under the weight of snow, and when I passed the frozen swamp, a voice moaned out. I stopped walking. Nothing, so I kept on going on the sparkling road until I heard it again. "Who's that?" I yelled. The moan came again. It was a man, somewhere in the swamp. I got closer, listening. There it was, a low and breathy noise, and with my cold ear I followed it. The swamp was frozen solid, the snow blown in piles, and so I slid over the ice looking for the source of the noise. Moonlight through bare tree limbs lit the swamp, and caught among the tree stumps and solid snow was a person sprawled out on the ground. He was trying to sit up but kept falling back, like he'd just done 1,000 crunches and was too sore to do just one more. It was Fellis. "Fellis," I said, standing over him. He tried to sit up, but something pulled him back down. "Fuck you," Fellis said. "Help me." He groaned, shivered. He didn't say how to help him, so I had to squat down to get a better look. I flicked my lighter and his purple lip quivered. "Hurry," he said. "Fellis," I said, "I can't help you if I don't know what's the matter with you." "My hair," he said. I looked at it with the lighter's flame. "Holy," I said, and I laughed. Instead of the tight braid that shined, Fellis's hair had come undone, and it was frozen into the snow. "Get me out, D," he said. "D, get me out." At first I tried to pull the hair out from the snow, tried to chip the snow away, but his hair wouldn't come loose, so I yanked and Fellis screamed. "Lift your head up," I said. I opened my pocket knife, and at the click of the blade, Fellis spoke. Wait, he said. "Don't cut it." "What do you want me to do?" I said. "Tell the ice to let go?" Fellis spit. "Go to my house and get boiling water." I closed the pocket knife. "Fellis," I said, "by the time I got back here, the water would be chilled." He was quiet. As if something walked around or among us, the ice cracked and echoed somewhere in the swamp. The moon shone bright and I looked. There was nobody but us. "I have to cut it," I said. "You ain't getting out if I don't." Fellis asked if I had a cigarette, and when I told him no, he cursed. "Fucking bullshit, fucking goddamn winter, what the fuck?" I laughed. "It ain't funny, D." "Look," I said, "you want me to cut my braid too?" Fellis took a deep breath and he coughed and gagged. "No," he said, "just cut it. I gotta get home. I'm sick." I opened the pocket knife again, grabbed his hair in a fistful and cut. When I got through the last bit of hair, Fellis rolled over and away from where he'd been stuck. He rubbed his head like he just woke up. I helped him stand, and we slipped all over the ice on our way out of the swamp. Through dry heaves, Fellis said he'd missed the bus this morning to the methadone clinic. "No shit," I said, because I didn't see him on the bus or at the clinic. And he thought some booze would be good before he got sick from not having any methadone. He'd had a bit of booze left that afternoon when he decided to go see Rab to get some pot, and on the way he'd stopped off in the swamp to feel the quiet that came with too much drinking, and when he plopped down in the snow he dozed right off. When he woke up, his hair was frozen in the snow. I got him to his mom's, Beth's, where he still lived. He walked fine by himself to the door, but I walked with him up the steps. "I never thought I'd scalp a fellow tribal member," I said. "Fuck off," he said. He fumbled in his pocket for his house key. "You want to smoke?" I asked. "Didn't you listen?" he said. "I didn't make it to Rab's." He unlocked the door. "I'll go for you," I said. "Give me the cash." Fellis looked at me. 20 minutes, I said. "I'll run there and back while you warm up your pretty bald head." He gave me $30, and I didn't ask where he got it from. Yesterday he said he didn't have any money. 20 bag, Fellis said, and stop at Jim's to get some tall boys and a bag of chips. Any kind but Humpty Dumpty chips. Down Fellis's driveway, I imagined the look on Rab's face when I gave him the money. "What'd I tell you? How about that gram?" "D," Fellis yelled. "One more thing. Bring me my hair so we can burn it. Don't want spirits after us." "We're damned anyway," I said, "but I guess I'll get your hair." I kept going, wondering, hair or pot first? Pot made the most sense. It would look strange having to set the hair and ice down like a soaked mop on the counter at Jim's while I reached in my pocket for Fellis's money. "Jim," that old wood booger would say, "we don't take those anymore." I'd look him square in his sagging face and say, "I'm not trading no hair, you old fucker," and I'd smack down on the counter a $10 bill for the tall boys and chips. With the change jingling in my pocket, I'd walk to Rab's and he'd say, "Get that hair out of here, it's dripping on my floor," and I'd have to plop the hair on the muddy white floor in the hallway while Rab reweighed the same nugs he'd weighed earlier for me. No. I'd grab Fellis's hair from the swamp on my way home. With Fellis on his unmade bed, me on a torn beanbag in the corner, each of us with a tall boy in the pot smoke haze and gray of the room, we'd keep poking and squeezing the hair, waiting for it to dry, waiting to burn it.
Thanks, Morgan. I really enjoyed hearing that. It really does bring it to life to hear the author read the story like that. I'm going to start with a very small detail in the story and that I've been curious about, and that's the hair being frozen into the snow. Is that something that you had happened to someone you know, or is this a pure invention on your part?
I wish it were a pure invention just because it's like so fantastically complex of an image, but I'd actually heard the story. A friend told me they'd heard it from somebody else, so I had learned of it and put it in my back pocket for when the moment arose, when the moment showed itself.
Yeah, that had to be something that you knew would be of use at some point in your writing, right?
Absolutely.
And is that what happens a lot in your process, that you just sort of call up things you remember or have heard and sort of put them into the story?
Yeah, I think, on my phone I keep a running list of like notes, some of which are, things that I remember happening, or things that I'm like, oh, this would be interesting if it happened. For example, in Earth Speak, I was like, wouldn't it be funny if two guys, saw on Antiques Roadshow how much a traditional root club sold for, and they went to steal it, and that's inventive. And then we think about In a Jar, and we think about the jar with the hair and the corn and the teeth, and that's actually something my sister found under her steps when she was living on the Mohawk Reservation with her boyfriend at the time. And so, I stole that. It's almost like with my real life moments that find their way into my stories. It's kind of like a quilt, this patterned quilt that I have to sort of work into being.
And how much of that do you weave through once you put the collection together? Do you look to pull in a detail that is somewhere else to have it, as a thread running through, or and it certainly feels like there are lots of elements that are threads running through it, or is that just kind of serendipity in some way?
I think it's part serendipity, but it's also, I think, recognizing that serendipity, and then also having sort of like the sort of gumption to go in and be like, okay, this thread is working, or this thread is not working. And somebody's always, a mentor of mine once said, life is random, art is pattern. And so, when I go in my stories, I try to find, those moments where I'm like, okay, is this working? Is this thread staying alive to the point where it's not becoming distracting, but it's, amplifying things in the strange way that, details do in fiction.
I should probably pull back maybe for people who haven't read the collection and talk about the narrative, which is really interesting, and I definitely have a few questions about that. But you essentially have two characters that you focus on in the stories and more or less alternate them throughout. One is named D, who was in this story, who's, I don't know, a guy maybe in his late teens, anywhere from there to 30s, somewhere in that age of early adulthood, I guess I'd say. And then there's a boy, David, who's in the other half of the stories. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that turns out to be the same person. Is that a spoiler?
No, I think I tried to make it like a surprise, but I was like, this is the most like melodramatic surprise ever, so I just, cut it and let it be.
I think the nice thing is that it is a surprise. It's just a matter of when you realize that. I don't think you automatically think, oh, David, maybe they're the same person. I think it's kind of a slow realization.
Yeah, and some readers actually never really noticed it until, way in the end. And, in the D stories themselves, it isn't until Earth Speak, which I think is, one of the final stories, it isn't until Earth Speak that we actually hear D referred to as David by his mother. And that's the only time, and that was my big like reveal, to be like, oh, it's absolute certainty that this is this is David.
Well, it's a confirmation at least to see that, and it's, I think, kind of gratifying for the reader. Another thing, it's really interesting. The stories alternate, but then at the end they don't. There's a sequence at the very end where you have, I think, 2 D stories and then 2 David stories. Is that something did you sort of shuffle around the stories at all, the pieces? Because they also don't appear to be chronological.
Yeah.
So how did you put it together, and what were you thinking as you did that?
Yeah, I mean, the first draft of this book didn't have D at all in it. The first draft of this book was 10 stories all told from David's point of view, starting with him as a boy in a jar, going all the way to Night of the Living Rez, which was actually the very first story I wrote for the book. But it was, when I finished it, I was like, this is a boring book. It just didn't work. Some of the stories were good and stood alone, but there was something missing. And I wrote Burn, and I tried to resist that main character being David, but when I just accepted it, it opened up a whole new window. And it's interesting because you can see that, and I started writing these D and Fellas stories, and you can see that the David narratives are all sort of chronological, but the D stories, there's no real chronology to it. There is a chronology because they're ordered in a certain way, but there's no real time markers. We don't see any age progression. We just know these two guys, and there's certainly a narrative that we're moving through. And so when I had that structure, that's when I was like, all right, now what do I do with it, right? Like, how do I, and I was like, it might be cool to go back and forth, right? If we do a David story, a D story, a David story, a D story. But then the question became, well, what is that serving? What is that doing? And for me, the whole time, what made it work for me, or what made me feel comfortable in doing that structure, was that it seemed to me that after reading the first two stories, the book is setting out to answer a question, which is what happened to this little boy we see in a jar. And for me, that's it was not about taking these stories and implicating them in a larger narrative, but more so suggesting they belong to this life of these people, and finding opportunities to really evince that and show it. And so I played around a lot with the structure, and ending with the two David stories. I think there was because before Night of the Living Rez, I believe there's Earth Speak, so we get we have the two D stories, and then we have the two David stories. And I just liked Night of the Living. I just loved The Name Means Thunder as an ending point. There's this very mature voice. I don't want to say it's an epilogue in a way, but it's it's very much it's not retelling anything, but it's telling this story that he's sort of forgotten. And I think it just, plays at this idea of memory and trauma, how it persists. And I just felt it was the perfect place to end the book.
Yeah, definitely. And that's another interesting thing that makes that story different, is there's more distance from the David character, and even more distance than, you ever really feel from the D character. It's definitely told from a future perspective relative to when the story unfolds. So, I think that was an interesting choice, because I don't know if this was your aim, but it sort of brings together the two strands. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think it does, because there's there's the past story, there's the narrator's story, and then there's the character's story really pronounced in that final story, which we don't get, like you said, in the David stories and the D stories. The narrative distance is so close between the character and the narrator in all of them except that last one.
Another interesting thing in the book, which I think is really well done, is events and actions. They seem to have consequences that play throughout the stories, whether they're chronological or not. Was that something you aimed to do, to make connections through consequences?
Yeah, I think, I always, I don't try to get too caught up with plot, but, I think, it all starts with character for me. It's like character, action equals character. And so when a character does something, that action has a consequence. It has at least one. Hopefully you get 3 or 4, and you got to try to figure out which one you're going to go with, and then maybe one of them will pop up later on that, so for me, I love making a mess of things. I love when characters do something, and they get themselves in trouble with, or I get overwhelmed and get myself in trouble with things that have to be reconciled in a way. And it's just, there's something really for me, lively about that, because, you know, we do that in life, you know, and I think it's the closest we can get to, like, I had mentioned earlier, a mentor had said life is random, art is pattern. But if we accept that art is just pattern, we might lose some life in a way. And so for me, it's about thinking about those consequences and being like, okay, well, this could have happened. How can we now rework it back into, you know, the story? How can we play with it in a way that makes this feel like you're watching somebody's life unfold?
Yeah. You know, to me, this book, in a lot of ways, you mentioned this earlier about memory and storytelling, especially in that last story where the narrator's not even sure exactly what happened and has contradictory stories. So is that something you thought about also, that there's like a built-in unreliability to both memory and storytelling?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think about it. I think about that idea of reliability. Like I'm deeply interested in honest fiction, you know, fiction that is like very, you know, truthful and isn't, you know, full of tricks and, you know, illusions and stuff. And I don't know, that's how I've always loved stories, but I've loved stories too that sort of depart from that. You know, my mother was remarkable at doing that. You know, something would happen and I'd be with her, you know, say her and somebody got into a bickering fight at the grocery store because their carts crashed or something, and hearing her retell the story to you know, an aunt on the phone, you know, I'm listening to it and it's, you know, going along and I'm like, yep, that's how it happened, that's how it happened, and then she would change it, and like random stuff just fell into these narratives of her life, of those moments. And so I love inventiveness, but I love like that truthful aspect, and I try to like do it as best I can, but I like to throw a nod to the fact that memory is, you know, memory. You know, we don't always get it right.
Mm. There are, you know, the characters are Native Americans, and it's mostly set on a Penobscot reservation, which we haven't even talked about at all yet. There are elements in there, you know, certain things that I'm not sure if I was getting all the significance of certain things. Like there's a lot of smoke, including smoking cigarettes, but burning things, smoke coming through. There's things that feel like just outright bad luck, like that house where a lot of it takes place seems to have a curse that, you know, maybe comes from that jar with the teeth. Did you think about it in that way?
I did, yeah. I was like, you know, there's, you know, this very strange, you know, like there is a strong sense of bad luck, and, you know, I was like, I don't feel like I need to explain it, you know. Like you mentioned, you're like, you know, the jar sort of sits in the back of your head throughout, you know, I think the book, and so I just sort of tried to let things be as best I could. You know, I think the moment we start explaining stuff is the moment we start to diminish the quality of something. I think if we can feel it, that's, you know, when it's at its most potent, you know, its most potent emotion for the story.
Yeah, and I should say, in terms of the, you know, native elements, native stories and kind of mythology within the story also, I think that seemed to have a relationship to things. And I just was curious about that. Is that just something that naturally sort of appears in these stories, or is that something you were very conscious of?
Both. I was very conscious of them because I didn't, you know, in all of the stories, I didn't want to put culture and like tradition and all of these things at the forefront. You know, I didn't want to use them as a means to gauge a reader's, you know, I didn't want to use that to manipulate them in any way. And so, you know, you know, when I'm drafting, I look for opportunities where I can, you know, introduce, you know, a story. And if it works, it works. If I feel like I'm using it as a means to manipulate a reader to feel a particular way, I kind of pull back. You know, for me, I always start with just universal, like the thing that all of us share, regardless of where we come from, is the fact that we can feel, right? You know, sadness, happiness, you know, anger. And that's what I build upon. And, you know, sometimes in a story, I'm able to get away with, you know, telling the story of the rock people, for example, or the swamp lady with the you know, the Pugwagees and or the Meekum Wests. And so for me, it's really about doing those stories justice in a way where they fit naturally with the stories that are being told.
Yeah. There's also some words that are in the Penobscot language, if I'm correct. And is that just part of people's conversation to throw in just certain native words into everyday conversation? That's what it feels like.
Yeah, it is. It's, you know, like gwus, my mom always used. I always use the example from when I took language art, Penobscot language, when I was in middle school. You know, the two most frequently used words in that class were abin, which is sit down, and just staux, which is shut up. But, you know, no, these words are all, you know, even more so now, are being used. You know, the language is just really blossoming and blooming. And I'll just share this quick tidbit, but, you know, the University of Maine in Orono, which is right next to the reservation, you know, every sign there is in English, but then also in Penobscot. And it's not a direct translation, it's how we would say it. And so the language is really doing, it's really existing and persisting and thriving.
Do people speak entirely in that language, or is it more a matter of introducing certain words?
There are a few fluent speakers, but mostly it's people just throw in words, or make up their own words based off of how, like, English works sometimes. What's it called? You know, like my friends and I, you know, the word chaguk means poop. And then we, you know, head would be, nadeb. So chaguk nadeb, like we would put those together, and it's like, you don't know if that appropriately works in the Penobscot language, but we use English, you know, rules to create it, which is fascinating, you know, to see language evolve in that way.
Yeah, it did seem like the words that were in Penobscot were either terms of affection or insults, some of which were affectionate insults as well. So, you know, a term like that, I think you could almost understand it without knowing exactly what the word means, which didn't stop me from, you know, Googling some of them to see if I could find a definition. But it didn't really seem necessary. That kind of code switching, I think we're all getting used to that. I think it's in all kinds of different fiction these days. And by the way, the same words that were most common in your classroom, same in Hebrew school. Shut up. Be quiet. That was the most common word you ever, you heard. So it's pretty much the same. Your feelings about the characters are interesting because there are some bad characters who do bad things, and sometimes even Dee or David do bad things, but it doesn't feel like anyone is bad. It seems to be absent of a certain kind of judgmentalism, even when things get really bad. Do you find yourself sometimes being too hard on your characters and backing off, or is it just natural for you to have that kind of acceptance of them?
I think maybe a mix of both. I try my hardest to, and it's, if you asked me how I felt about these characters, I don't know if I'd be able to give you an answer, but, the things that they do, the things that they've done, the things that people just in general do, it's like a big question that I've always have been really, really interested in is, how do we forgive people for what they've done? And, it's easy to forgive somebody who steals. It's easy to forgive somebody who does, there are degrees to which we can forgive, but as a society, we reach a maximum, and I think it's, cultural, we reach a maximum where we're like, we don't know what to do with this, percentage of people who commit these types of, acts, how do we forgive them? And, it's a question that I think is really central to this book, but it's also just sort of central to the fiction I write. How do we learn to love those who have done such terrible things? And it's a tough question, and I don't know if there will be an answer or a solution, but it's worth asking again and again and again.
Yeah, I think sometimes some of the worst people are also, in certain circumstances, some of the nicest. There's this part with this problematic character, Frick, who's in the David stories, and it seems as though David understands he's not a good guy necessarily, but remembers particulars that were nice and were good. I don't know what my question about that is, but maybe you can just talk about, arriving at that moment.
Yeah. For me, it's like, because, to not give any spoilers away, we come to learn that Frick is not a great, it's a very strange story, but, readers are left, with their, however they want to feel and think, but, putting myself in David's shoes, it's like, okay, there's that, but then there are the, 10 plus years of him caring for him in various ways, picking him up to try to go find his mother, right? Even though he's reluctant, bringing his backpack in, changing his, the chain on his bike. And I don't mean to suggest that these little things that people do counteract the weight of an atrocious act. But what do we do with them, right? Do we delete them from our minds, or do we put them out there for some sort of sense of memory about who this person is, right? That they're not one single thing, but that they are in fact, a complex, messy individual. And I think that's what, humanity is. And that's what, I think the best fiction is trying to do, is trying to sort of tease that out in a way where readers are left feeling a certain way, but also feeling uncomfortable maybe in the way that they feel about particular people and the things that they've done.
What do you think? Do you think about David or Dee beyond this book, or does that character stay with you? And where do you think he goes? What do you think happens to him? All of these bad things have happened, but there's also a certain resilience, right? So, where is he when he's telling that last story with that perspective? Has he gotten to a better place, or is he still having some of the same struggles, do you think?
I think he's having maybe some of the same struggles, but I think he has reached a point where he has lived a life. He has experienced an immense amount of, we could say, pain and trauma, but he also experienced an immense amount of love and tenderness and caring from, his mother and his sister. And, he may not be the perfect person at his age in that final story, but I like to think that he's found peace. I like to think that he has come to terms with where his life has taken him.
All right. Well, Morgan, thank you very much. Really enjoyed talking about this book. There's a lot to it, and there's a lot to talk about. And, I hope you continue with the writing, whether it goes in a different direction or follows a similar form or not. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Larry.
And now, Jay Lindsay, the president of the Chisholm Foundation, which supports the Story Prize, will announce this year's winner.
Thank you, Larry. First of all, let me thank you for navigating Plan B and for orchestrating such an entertaining evening. Thank you. The Chisholm Foundation is very proud to have been supporting the Story Prize since the get-go, and we're really pleased to be a part of this very special short story community, which has brought so much to so many people. In a minute, I'm going to announce the winner of the 19th Story Prize, but first I wanted to acknowledge all of the authors that submitted works for this year's prize. I think you said there were 119 authors, a very healthy industry. I wanted to thank the judges for the very difficult job of selecting the winner. And I wanted to thank all of you for being here and for, again, supporting this wonderful art form. So without any further ado, let me announce the winner of the 19th Story Prize, and that is Ling Ma.
Well, I'm glad I showed up. I prepared a few words. Sorry, this is now, I wrote this on the plane. Just a few words I wanted to say that I learned how to be a fiction writer by writing short stories, and I can't totally explain why, but I still find this form to be like extremely daunting and difficult. A novel can take years to write, but in my experience, it can also take that long to complete a satisfactory short story. Bliss Montage spans a very long period of my life, more than a decade, and when I look at the book, there are many echoes of past drafts in here, and I can chart all of the different ways that I try to be a writer when I look through each story. So this is my way of saying that I really appreciate this prize, and I wanted to thank my publisher, my agent, and my editor. I also wanted to thank my family and my friends, Kirsten, who's here with me tonight, for putting up with me while I was writing this and complaining the whole time. Thank you so much.
So we'd like to invite you to join us for cocktails and conversation across the hall. Thank you.